The sound cracked through the conference room like something sharp and sudden. 2 quick snaps of Derek Vaughn's fingers, aimed directly at me. "Sweetheart," he said casually, not even glancing away from the investors seated around the table, "pull up the real numbers." The room went quiet for exactly half a second, just long enough for every person there to understand what had just happened. I was standing at the head of the table. The presentation remote was in my right hand. The same presentation I had built from nothing, working late on 3 consecutive nights to get every figure exactly right. The numbers Derek was asking for were mine. The contract sitting in front of the clients was mine. Every protection clause, every pricing structure, every legal safeguard in that entire document, mine. But Derek leaned back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed I had simply wandered into the wrong room. A couple of investors smiled politely at the exchange. My boss stared down at the table. My chest burned so hot, I was genuinely afraid I might cry right there in front of everyone. But I didn't, because Derek had just made a mistake he couldn't see yet. The kind that arrogant people make when they confuse humiliation with power. He snapped his fingers at me, so I snapped his company's contract in half. Derek turned back to the investors with a smooth, easy smile. "This deal was entirely my idea," he said. My throat tightened immediately, not from embarrassment, from something sharper than that. Because it was not his idea. Not the structure, not the pricing model, not the conditional timelines that protected the company from liability. Not the expansion rights framework, not the performance safeguards built into the back half of the document. I had written all of it, every single clause. And Derek knew that better than anyone in that room, because he had been there when I walked him through the whole thing 2 weeks earlier, page by page, answering every question he had until he fully understood what he was presenting. But here, in front of the investors, that conversation had apparently never happened. He spoke about the contract like it had come from his own brilliance. Like he had sat down one afternoon and produced it from nothing. And no one corrected him. No one ever corrected Derek. Not out loud, anyway. An investor near the far end of the table shifted slightly and looked at me. Not at Derek, at me. He had been watching the whole exchange carefully, and he asked me a direct question that Derek, sitting right there with his confident smile, had absolutely no answer for. "Are you the contracts manager on this account?" the investor asked. He was addressing me directly, not Derek. The room shifted. Derek's smile stayed fixed, but something behind his eyes flickered. "My name is Lila Mercer," I said calmly. "Contracts manager. I drafted the agreement you're reviewing today." Derek gave a short, easy laugh, the kind designed to smooth over awkward moments. "Lila keeps the details organized," he said. "That's what she's here for." He said it warmly. Generously, even. Like he was paying me a compliment. But the framing was deliberate. He wanted the investors to picture a competent assistant, someone who arranged things neatly so Derek could think big. Not the person who had actually built the deal from the ground up. I looked at the investor who had asked the question. He held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary, and I understood that he was paying close attention. Derek steered the conversation back to himself. But I held on to that small moment. I had been doing this job for 4 years. I knew what the contract said and what it didn't say. I knew where every clause lived and why each one existed. Derek believed I was decoration. He had believed that from the very beginning. The first time we had ever worked together, he had made it perfectly clear. 6 months earlier, Derek had dropped a thick file on my desk without stopping. He kept walking while he talked, like my presence barely registered. "Clean this up," he said. "Big client meeting Friday." No explanation of what was wrong with it, no context, no courtesy, just expectation. I opened the file and found a contract draft that was a complete mess. Incomplete clauses, missing liability protections, vague delivery language that would have exposed the company significantly if anything went wrong. It would have taken Derek maybe 15 minutes to spot those problems himself, if he had ever actually read what he was handing out. I stayed until almost 9 o'clock that night. I rewrote the entire agreement. I added a performance safeguard clause and restructured the pricing section so the company wouldn't be on the hook for terms they couldn't possibly meet. I cross-referenced the legal requirements and made sure every single page was clean and defensible. Friday morning, I came in early and placed the revised document on Derek's desk. He walked into the meeting and presented it as his own work. Not once did he mention my name. The client signed. Derek accepted congratulations in the hallway while I packed up my bag. I told myself it was a one-time thing, but the pattern had already started. Every deal Derek closed followed the same script. He walked into a room. He made large, confident promises. He charmed people easily. He was genuinely good at that part, I'll admit. He had the kind of presence that made people feel like the deal they were considering was actually the opportunity of a lifetime. But the careful, unglamorous work of building contracts that held up under pressure, that always ended up on my desk. And when the deal closed, Derek collected the praise. Operations cleaned up whatever promises he had made that couldn't quite be kept. Legal quietly adjusted expectations. And the people who did the actual work watched from a distance while Derek shook hands and smiled for photographs. It happened once, then twice, then often enough that I stopped being surprised. The first time I watched him take direct credit for one of my drafts in a meeting, I felt a hot, burning rush of anger. I went home that evening and spent a long time staring at the ceiling, wondering if I should say something to someone. But I had stayed quiet, because I was still learning how things worked in that office. I was still figuring out who would actually listen. This deal, though, was different from every deal that had come before it. Different in size, different in visibility, and different in exactly how much damage a lie could do. The investor group that walked into our conference room that Tuesday represented the largest single contract our company had pursued in 2 years. 6 people. Sharp-eyed, quiet, unhurried. The kind of investors who have seen 100 presentations and know exactly which questions to ask to find the gaps in any story. Everyone in the office was nervous. I could feel it in the way people moved through the hallways that morning. Slightly faster than usual, slightly more careful with their words. Everyone except Derek. Derek thrived in rooms like this. The more pressure there was, the more relaxed he became. He fed on the energy of important moments. He had the rare ability to appear completely at ease when everyone around him was quietly panicking. Honestly, that quality alone had taken him further in his career than most people would ever admit out loud. But charisma has a significant blind spot. When you rely on presence and charm to carry a room, you stop reading fine print carefully. You move fast, you make promises, you build momentum. And the small, precise, legally binding details buried in the pages nobody performs for an audience, those get skipped entirely. Derek had skipped one very specific detail in this contract, and I already knew exactly which one it was, because I was the one who had written it. I had built the safeguard into page 12. It wasn't visible unless you read carefully, which was exactly the point of a safeguard. The clause was clean and specific. It stated that if any party misrepresented deliverables, expectations, or timelines, verbally or in writing, in connection with the agreement, the contract could be immediately suspended pending a formal review. It was there to protect the company. I had written it after a different deal, one where Derek had promised a client a timeline the company had no realistic way to meet, and the company had spent 3 difficult weeks quietly managing the fallout, while Derek moved smoothly on to his next pitch. I had brought the clause to our legal department. Our head attorney at the time, a careful, methodical woman named Patricia Okafor, had read it twice, nodded slowly, and said, "This belongs in every contract going forward." It did not end up in every contract going forward. Derek had pushed back hard. "Safeguards slow momentum," he said. "They make clients feel uncertain. They make the company look like it doesn't fully trust its own promises." So the clause lived quietly in my contracts, drafted carefully, never announced loudly. Derek hated safeguards. He was about to hate this particular one most of all. We were 40 minutes into the meeting when Derek made the promise. He had been building toward it for a while, layering confidence on top of confidence, pulling the investors slowly forward like someone reeling in a line. He leaned toward the group with that particular expression he wore when he was about to say something he knew would land well. "We guarantee full rollout," he said, "within 90 days of signing." My stomach dropped completely. Not because 90 days was a bad-sounding number. It sounded confident and capable, and exactly the kind of thing investors like to hear in a well-run meeting. But the contract I had written, sitting right there on the table in front of everyone, did not allow for that timeline. Not legally. The agreement used conditional language tied to client onboarding milestones. 90 days only worked if every single preliminary step was completed on a very specific schedule. If anything slipped, and things always slipped, the company would be dangerously exposed. Derek either hadn't read that section carefully enough, or simply didn't care. He turned toward me with a bright, open expression, like he was doing me a personal favor by including me in the moment. And the whole room turned to follow his gaze. Every eye moved in my direction at once. "Lila can confirm," Derek said. He smiled the way someone smiles when they believe the answer is already decided. The room waited. 6 investors, my boss standing near the door, 2 members of the operations team brought in for the meeting, all watching me. Derek expected a nod, a small, cooperative confirmation. Just enough to close the circle and push the room forward before anyone had time to think carefully about what had just been promised. My fingers tightened around the presentation remote. I thought about the clause on page 12. I thought about what happened the last time a promise like this one went completely unchallenged. And I thought about what my name, being on this contract, actually meant the moment things went wrong later on. "The contract specifies conditional timelines," I said. My voice came out steady and clear. "Rollout within 90 days is achievable if the onboarding milestones outlined in Section 4 are completed on schedule. The agreement doesn't guarantee a flat timeline, regardless of what conditions exist at the time." A short silence followed. One investor immediately picked up their copy of the contract and turned to Section 4. Derek's smile didn't disappear, but it tightened. It shifted from genuine to carefully managed, and that small change told me everything I needed to know about how the next conversation between us would go. The meeting ended politely. Hands were shaken. The investors said they would review everything and follow up by the end of the week. They were professional and completely unreadable as they filed out, the natural composure of experienced people who want to think before they respond to anything. Derek waited until the last elevator door had closed in the hallway. Then he appeared beside me. Not in front of me. Beside me. Close and quiet, turned slightly away. The posture of someone having a conversation they don't want overheard. "You embarrassed me in there," he said. "I protected the contract," I replied. "The timeline was manageable. Not legally, not as written." He was quiet for a moment. "Investors don't need every clause read to them out loud like a warning label," he said. "That's not how you close a deal. It's how you close a deal that actually holds up afterward," I said. His voice dropped lower. "Next time," he said, "when I say confirm, just confirm." He walked away without waiting for my response. I stood in that hallway for a long moment after he turned the corner. My heart was beating harder than it should have been. Not from fear, from the clear, certain knowledge of exactly what I needed to do next. I went back to my desk and started documenting everything. I pulled every email thread connected to this deal. All of it. The introductory messages, the meeting follow-ups, the negotiation exchanges, the timeline discussions. I exported the entire chain and organized it carefully by date, reading through every message with the contract open beside me on screen. What I found made my pulse quicken, in a way I hadn't expected. Over the previous 3 weeks, Derek had sent multiple messages to the investor group directly, outside the formal negotiation channels, outside any thread I had been copied on. In those messages, he had made specific promises. He told the lead investor that 90 days was a firm, unconditional commitment. He described the rollout as guaranteed regardless of preliminary steps. He stated that the company would absorb any additional costs if the timeline needed adjusting. None of those promises existed anywhere in the actual contract, but every one of those emails had been sent with a version of my draft attached. My version. My name was on the document metadata, my formatting, my clause structure, which meant that if those promises collided with reality and the whole deal collapsed, the paper trail would lead directly to the contract. And the contract led directly to me. My name, my desk, my responsibility. I sat very still for a long time after understanding that. I stayed at my desk for a long time after realizing what I was looking at. Not panicking, just thinking. My name was on every version of that document, not Derek's, mine. Contracts manager Leela Mercer. The revision history showed my login on every single draft. If anyone traced a failed deal back through the paperwork, I would be the name they found at the source every single time. Derek had understood this, I realized. He hadn't simply overlooked the difference between my role and his. He had built carefully around it. He made the promises. I wrote the documents. When praise was handed out, he was standing at the front of the room, accepting it. When problems needed to be explained, the paper trail pointed cleanly to the contracts desk. My desk. I sat with this understanding for a long moment, letting it settle fully. Then I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, something cooler and far more useful than anger. The specific clarity that arrives when you stop hoping a situation will improve on its own and start seeing it clearly for exactly what it is. Derek hadn't taken credit carelessly. He had constructed an arrangement designed to benefit from my work while insulating himself from my problems. The next meeting confirmed that everything I had just understood was entirely correct. The second investor meeting was scheduled 10 days later. I arrived early and organized my materials. The same investors returned, joined this time by 2 additional team members, both of whom had clearly been brought in to review specific contract details far more carefully than the first meeting had allowed. Derek walked in 5 minutes before start time, sharp and composed as always. He sat down, scanned the new faces briefly, and began. 15 minutes in, he turned toward me. He snapped his fingers. Same gesture, same casual energy. Like the first time had been completely unremarkable, which made this second time feel even less remarkable than that. Lila will handle any paperwork questions, he told the investors. That's her area. He said it dismissively. Not even as a setup for me to speak, more as a signal that the paperwork level of this conversation was below his attention and therefore delegated downward. A few people made small notes, but the investors didn't let the meetings stay at Derek's level this time. They had clearly read the contract carefully since the first meeting, and they had specific, detailed, technical questions about things Derek had claimed with such confidence before. The questions started immediately, and they were not the kind of questions that charm and confidence could carry alone. The first question came from a sharp, careful investor named Conrad. He asked about liability coverage in the event that a third-party vendor delayed the rollout past the stated window. Derek answered confidently, and incorrectly. I corrected him calmly, pointing to the exact section of the contract that addressed third-party obligations and how they interacted with the delivery timeline. Conrad nodded and made a note. The second question came from a woman across the table, composed and precise, clearly the person on her team who actually read documents thoroughly before any meeting. She asked about the expansion rights clause. Under what conditions could the client extend the agreement to additional divisions within their organization? Derek glanced at the contract and offered a reasonable-sounding guess. Wrong. I corrected him again. This time, I watched the room absorb the correction differently. Because it was the second time. And when something happens twice, people stop filing it under coincidence. The investors began directing their questions toward me instead of Derek. Not rudely, not dramatically, just practically. The natural adjustment people make when they figure out who in a room actually holds the answers. Derek noticed. I saw it in the slight stiffening across his shoulders, in the way his smile became something he was actively maintaining rather than something that was simply there. He noticed, and he did not like it at all. 2 hours after the second meeting ended, I received an automated system notification. I had been removed from the deal email thread, not moved to a secondary list, removed entirely. 0 visibility, 0 access. I sat looking at the notification for a long, still moment. Derek had removed my access to the primary communication channel for a deal built entirely around a contract I had written. He had done it within 2 hours of a meeting where investors had spent significant time directing their questions to me instead of him. The logic was straightforward. He believed cutting off my visibility would cut off my ability to interfere. No access to the thread meant no ability to correct him in real time. No ability to flag promises that contradicted the actual written contract. No ability to be the person in the room who actually had the answers. He thought removing me from the conversation would silence me completely. But the moment he did it, he created something very specific. Proof. Documented, time-stamped evidence, showing that immediately after a meeting where his errors were corrected in front of investors, I was stripped of access to a deal I had built from nothing. I took a screenshot of the notification. I added it to the folder I had already started building. And I watched carefully from a distance, while Derek's promises grew larger and less accurate with each passing day. I heard about the new promise through an operations team member. Her name was Ren. She was methodical, careful, and had a habit of forwarding things she thought I should know about, sending them quietly, with a short note that just said, "Just so you're aware." She forwarded me an email Derek had sent to the investors the previous afternoon. In it, Derek had promised a delivery schedule that included full implementation across all of the client's departments within 60 days, not 90, plus a complete customization phase within that same window. I read it twice. Then I opened our internal capacity report. Our implementation team had 4 active projects running at the same time. Adding a full-scale deployment of this size with a 60-day hard deadline was not possible. Not without pulling people off other accounts that had their own contracts and their own legal guarantees already attached. If Derek signed the contract with those promises in writing, the company would be exposed on multiple fronts simultaneously. This was no longer about Derek taking credit for my work. This was about the company signing an agreement it genuinely could not honor. My chest tightened. I printed Derek's email. I printed the capacity report. I printed the original contract with the safeguard clause highlighted clearly in yellow on page 12. Then I walked down the hallway to legal. Our legal department was staffed by 2 in-house attorneys. The senior attorney was a tall, methodical man named Franklin Osei. He had been with the company for 11 years and had the particular quality of being completely impossible to rush under any circumstances. I placed the 3 documents on his desk. He read each one in order, slowly and without expression. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly. "He said this in writing?" Franklin asked. "Multiple emails sent directly to the lead investor. And the contract doesn't support this delivery schedule. Not even close." He leaned forward and picked up the contract copy, turning to page 12. "This clause is yours?" he asked. "I drafted it. Patricia Okafor approved it about 8 months ago." He read the clause carefully a second time. "And Derek has the final signing scheduled for end of the week?" "Friday morning," I said. He set the papers down and looked at me directly. "If this contract is signed with those email promises sitting in the background, and the company cannot meet the delivery schedule, and it cannot, we are looking at a significant breach of contract claim. Potentially a very large one." "I know. And the clause you wrote would have prevented all of this." "That's exactly why I wrote it," I said. Franklin read the clause a third time. He was the kind of lawyer who never said anything definitively until he had read something enough times to be completely certain. The clause was straightforward. Any material misrepresentation of deliverables, timelines, or capabilities, whether made verbally or in writing, by any party connected to the agreement, constituted grounds for immediate contract suspension pending a formal internal and external review. Derek had made those exact misrepresentations in writing. The emails were time-stamped. They named the deal specifically by name. They promised a delivery schedule the company demonstrably, provably could not meet. "This clause is enforceable," Franklin said. "I know it is." "Derek doesn't know you've brought this here." "Correct." He looked at me with the careful, steady expression of someone quietly calculating next steps. "If the contract is signed before we can intervene, the process becomes significantly more complicated and expensive," he said. "The clause can still be triggered afterward, but it creates a much longer, harder road." "He's signing Friday, which gives us 3 days." He closed the folder carefully and placed both hands flat on the desk. "I need to bring in the executive team," he said. Stopping a signing goes above my level on its own. I nodded. Derek had scheduled the signing ceremony for Friday morning. He had absolutely no idea what was already quietly in motion around him. Friday arrived gray and cold. The boardroom had been prepared carefully, printed materials at every seat, a branded folder positioned in front of the client's chair. Water glasses filled, coffee arranged perfectly, everything polished and intentional, the visual language of a deal that was ready to close. The investors filed in, looking pleased. The process had moved faster than most deals do, and from the outside it must have looked like a clean, well-managed operation. Derek entered last, as he always did. He wore a dark jacket and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who believed he was 30 minutes away from the best professional moment of his year. He shook hands with the lead investor, exchanged warm words, and settled comfortably into the chair at the head of the table. The contract sat in the center, clean and crisp and ready. Derek picked up his pen and smiled at the room. Then he turned slightly in my direction. He snapped his fingers, the same gesture, 2 short, casual snaps like a habit he hadn't even noticed he had developed over time. "Lila," he said lightly, "go ahead and confirm we're all set." The room waited. Every face turned toward me. Derek held his pen just above the signature line, and I looked directly at him and said one single word with absolute calm. "No." The word was quiet, but in a room that had gone completely still, quiet was more than loud enough. Derek's pen didn't move. A few investors exchanged a quick glance. Conrad, the careful one, sat slightly forward in his seat. "Lila." Derek's voice was controlled, but only just barely. He was speaking through a smile now, maintaining it deliberately. "We've been through everything already. Let's keep moving." "The contract can't be signed in its current form," I said. "We've reviewed it thoroughly." "The contract, yes, but not the emails." I opened the folder I had brought into the room. Over the past 2 weeks, promises were made to this group outside the agreement, in writing specifically, that directly contradict what the contract can legally support. Signing today, with those representations already on record, creates immediate grounds for a breach of contract claim. I slid Derek's emails to the center of the table. I placed the relevant contract sections beside them. Then I set page 12, the safeguard clause, highlighted clearly in yellow, directly in front of the lead investor. Derek stared at me. Not with anger. With something far more complicated than anger. The investors reached for the documents, and Derek's pen lowered slowly, quietly, back down to the table. I turned to page 12 and read the clause aloud. No drama. No performance. Just the words exactly as written, in a clear, steady voice. Any material misrepresentation of deliverables, timelines, or capabilities, whether made verbally or in writing, prior to or concurrent with the execution of this agreement, constitutes grounds for immediate suspension of the signing process pending formal review. I set the contract down carefully. The investors were reading. Conrad moved quickly between Derek's emails and the contract pages, and from the precision of his focus I could see that he understood exactly what he was looking at and exactly what it meant for the deal. Derek began speaking. "This is being taken completely out of." The boardroom door opened. Franklin Osei walked in. He had been waiting in the hallway. I had told him what time the meeting was scheduled and exactly which page I would read when the moment came. He entered quietly and positioned himself near the door without sitting down. His presence alone shifted the energy in the entire room, because everyone around that table understood immediately that when the legal team appears at a signing, the signing is no longer moving forward on its original timeline. Derek turned to look at Franklin. Franklin looked back at him with the calm, unhurried expression of someone who had read everything carefully and had no questions remaining. Derek's confidence cracked visibly for the very first time. The signing stopped. Franklin addressed the room briefly and professionally. He explained that the legal team had identified representations made in connection with the agreement that required careful review before the contract could be executed. He thanked the investors for their patience and requested 48 hours. The investors agreed without hesitation. They were not angry. They were careful. There is an important difference between those two things. Derek sat very still at the head of the table while the investors gathered their materials. Two of them stopped to examine the highlighted clause a second time before standing. Conrad folded the printed email copies carefully and placed them in his jacket pocket without a word. The lead investor looked directly at Derek before leaving the room. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Within 2 hours of the room emptying, the investors had collectively sent a formal written request for a complete documentation review. They wanted every version of the contract, every draft, every revision, every connected email thread. They requested timestamps and full revision histories, and then they included one final request. They asked that any further communication about the deal be directed through legal rather than through Derek personally. That last line was the one that made everything clear. The room that had admired Derek's confidence now studied him carefully. And Derek sat surrounded by paperwork that told a very different story from the one he had been performing. Derek didn't accept what had happened quietly. When the formal documentation review began the following morning, he requested an urgent meeting with the executive team. I wasn't invited. I heard about it afterward through a brief, careful message from Franklin. In that meeting, according to Franklin's note, Derek described the situation as a deal being sabotaged by a disgruntled team member who had inserted a problematic clause into a contract without proper authorization. He used my name specifically. The executives asked Franklin to present the timeline. Franklin presented it. He showed Derek's emails to the investors. He showed the delivery schedule Derek had promised in writing. He showed the internal capacity report, demonstrating those promises were impossible to fulfill without damaging multiple other active accounts simultaneously. He showed Patricia Okafor's written approval of the safeguard clause from 8 months earlier. And he showed the time-stamped notification confirming I had been removed from the deal thread. Exactly 2 hours after the meeting, where investors had directed their questions away from Derek, he laid every document out in the same careful, methodical order he had used when I first placed them on his desk. The silence that followed lasted exactly as long as it took the executives to read what Franklin had placed in front of them. Derek was asked to leave the meeting room. The deal did not collapse. Franklin's team spent the following week working directly with the investors to restructure the agreement around terms the company could genuinely, demonstrably meet. The timeline was extended to something realistic. The delivery schedule was made properly conditional. Every promise Derek had made in his private emails was formally retracted in writing and replaced with accurate, honest representations. The investors did not walk away. They were careful people who wanted a viable deal, not a fast one. A contract built on accurate terms was worth far more to them than a contract built on impressive-sounding claims. What they did not want was Derek Vaughn representing their account going forward. They put this in writing. They requested that the account be managed by someone who demonstrably understood the contract in full detail. The executive team called me into a meeting 2 days after the restructuring was finalized. Our CEO, a steady, direct woman named Adrienne Cole, sat at the far end of the conference table. She looked tired in the specific way people look tired after a full week of very difficult conversations with no clean answers. She placed a folder on the table and pushed it toward me. "We owe you an apology," she said quietly. "And we owe you a promotion." I opened the folder. Lead Contracts Director, effective immediately. My hands didn't shake this time. I still hear that sound sometimes. 2 sharp snaps of fingers. Casual. Dismissive. The sound of someone deciding without much thought at all that the person in front of them was small enough to be summoned rather than spoken to directly. Derek had stood in that conference room, surrounded by work I had built, and had genuinely believed that his confidence was the most powerful thing in the room. He wasn't the first person to believe that. He won't be the last. But confidence without accuracy is just noise. It fills space beautifully and impresses people completely, right up until the moment something goes wrong. Then it becomes the most expensive thing in the room. The clause on page 12 had existed in that contract for 8 months without ever being needed. I hadn't written it with Derek specifically in mind. I had written it because things go wrong in business, and the actual job of a contracts manager is to make sure that when they do, there is already a clean, clear legal mechanism in place to protect everyone involved. That is what the work actually is. Not decoration, not paperwork support, not confirmation on demand. It is the quiet, careful building of the thing that holds when everything else begins to shake. Derek snapped his fingers at me. So I let the contract speak clearly for itself. And when it did, every single person in that room listened.